We are Port. We are a global education firm that mentors students one-on-one to create impact projects. We're interviewing top student leaders around the globe to hear what they are doing and their incredible stories. Sophie, just give an introduction to yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sophie Wang. I'm 18 years old. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, and I moved and currently reside here in Portland, Oregon. And I'll be headed to the University of Pennsylvania in the fall. During high school, I focused mostly with a niche of like healthcare community work and advocacy. My path towards like medicine or just healthcare wasn't anything like an aha moment. My parents are both engineers. They're very logical, and just seeing them always sitting down, staring at a computer made me realize that maybe I don't really want to do their job. I always found myself wanting to be like creatively challenged. So I found myself venturing into public health because I felt like there was a lot more diversity in terms of like the topics and the overall work that you can do, which for me, I found my passion was community. So that's the reason why I ventured out to basically create my own initiative, Youth HPV Champions.
Tell us about that. What is the topic? What's your mission and what did you accomplish?
Youth HPV Champions is a student-driven initiative that I co-founded dedicated towards raising awareness about HPV prevention among young people. HPV is an infection. It's actually very common. I found that actually 3 of 4 15 to 24-year-olds are exposed to HPV at some point in their lifetime. And so some of the infections, they basically are harmless. You kind of get them, but your body basically is able to fight it on its own. But then there are certain strains of HPV that are cancer causing. HPV is indeed an STD. That's the kind of infection that it is, which is why it almost carries this sort of stigma in a lot of communities right now. Youth HPV Champions is trying to combat and address to make sure that HPV in general in conversations are more normalized. And we do this through community events, conference summits that feature keynote speakers and hands-on workshops. And our goal is to essentially equip students with the tools to become peer advocates for HPV prevention and to inspire collective action to reduce HPV-related infections and therefore cancers. We've impacted over 3,000 youth across 3 states. And we've also launched Oregon's first something called the HPV Toolkit, which is basically a detailed guide for youth to advocate for HPV vaccines in their own communities. And finally, we've also hosted 2 statewide annual conferences, and all that work that I just listed has basically solidified our position as the largest youth-led HPV initiative in the Pacific Northwest.
What encouraged you to advocate for the issue as opposed to just brushing it by?
I actually had a mentor who was someone very close to me, and they were diagnosed with cervical cancer that was caused by an HPV infection that they got when it was really young. Once you initially get an infection, it can take decades for a cancer caused by it to actually arise. When she opened up to me, I realized, I never learned about HPV. I didn't hear about it in my school health class. I didn't really hear about it anywhere. I was struck by the statistics of HPV is something really common. And so that moment kind of solidified that HPV was a global health issue that needed attention.
Walk through your journey of building that from the ground up.
It goes way back. First of all, I knew that I needed a team and I couldn't do this alone. I attended a bunch of boothing events, like literally taking anything that I could to set up a table. I literally made all my prints on Canva. I designed the logo myself, and I just kept on handing out flyers to youths. I remember I went to a career expo, and that was one of our most successful events in which I could actually, present this initiative idea to a lot of others. And then through that, I gathered what I like to call an executive council. So a bunch of other high schoolers from across different high schools in Oregon. After that, I separated my team into specific committees. For example, I had a conference committee, a social media committee, a community engagement committee. We needed students at specific schools and around the area to talk about HPV prevention. And so we wanted to recruit what would be known as ambassadors. And after that, we began shifting our focus towards our annual conference. My team and I decided to create an initial workshop conference training for purely just our ambassadors to be fully informed. And then after that, all the training is done and we have a bunch of youth who are ready to begin organizing our conference. That was just a lot of planning on space, catering, merchandise, who was giving what workshop, and also who was going to be chosen as a keynote speaker. We also wanted to include the work that our ambassadors were doing at their own respective schools. So we ended up organizing this almost sort of showcase, posters or anything that would showcase the work that they've been doing to highlight that at the conference, just so that attendees could walk around and visibly see the physical work that people their age were also doing about HPV.
What was the biggest challenge you had when you were organizing the logistics of the conference?
Getting people to come, because we were trying to we spend a lot of time just looking at the existing communities that we were already a part of and then trying to reach out to them to see if there were students interested. For example, I went to a health-based high school, so I was like, you know what, let me just try to advocate and outreach about our conference to the people who may already be interested, because it is similar, like HPV and healthcare, that could have some ties there. And then I guess another challenge of just getting the conference to what it was just a lot of communication within. I know that as a founder, I was kind of overseeing all the specific committees, so it felt like I was one person handling a 10-person job, because I always wanted to stay informed of what each committee was doing. Sometimes that caused a lot of stress and a lot of burnout, so I would kind of have to step back when my other committees or the members of my executive council depended on me. So that kind of communication and finding that balance was definitely tough at such a big state conference like the one that we were organizing.
What was the biggest reaction you ever got from someone after sharing the topic?
There has been a lot of moments in which I could directly sense that I was not being taken seriously. I felt that a lot of times they would be easily very quickly dismissed, especially when I was trying to advocate and gather attendees from rural parts of Oregon that I would travel to, because it's not very common that you see a female Asian American teenager advocating for something like HPV. So I'd say that the reactions weren't distasteful or disrespectful because they were anti-vaccine for what HPV was, but there were definitely many times where I could sense that right after hearing that I was going to be talking about HPV, they became immediately not engaged. Just in those situations, try my best to shift the conversation less around oh, HPV is an STD, but more so HPV or getting a vaccine for HPV is cancer prevention, and that is something that we all care about. That can help in that sense. It's not just about HPV or you being sexually active or you having an STD. It's about you protecting yourself from the cancers that HPV could cause.
What was one of the most heartwarming moments as you were working on the initiative that made you go, wow, this is making a really big difference?
I remember after our conference, our annual conference, we just had a horde of people basically coming up to our keynote speaker who was actually an HPV survivor. She dealt with so many cancers that were related to HPV, and she took so many surgeries, had to use a breathing tube because she got oropharyngeal cancer. And I just remember the horde of students that came up to her and were inspired by her story, said that, it really made them feel inspired and want to talk more about HPV because that's how much her story resonated with other people, even if they didn't experience it themselves. Even if though it wasn't specifically about oh, Youth HPV Champions, they affected me. I saw how they reacted to a part that my team and I worked really hard to organize, and that in itself was so impactful to me. We gathered an audience who came here basically knowing nothing about HPV, and in the end they asked more questions and stayed past our conference time that was scheduled to just ask questions and learn more about what HPV is with an actual survivor, someone that I could personally see my mentor that had cervical cancer with. So that connection really meant a lot to me in that aspect.
Thinking about the high school students who might want to start an initiative similar to HPV, maybe there's a stigma around it that people are uncomfortable with hearing about. What advice would you give to that high school student now that you've gone through this entire process?
Honestly, I can't give any more advice than to just find other people who are interested. And I know that coming from myself, trying to gather youth who were also interested, it was hard. That's probably the hardest part, because when you find a team of people who you actually find that they actually are passionate about the same thing as you, no matter how seemingly stigmatized or underrepresented it is, you gain energy off of their passion as well, and that kind of becomes a two-way relationship, and that in itself can be your motivator even when things are completely on the down low and you can't really talk about it. We weren't really getting a lot of response from attendees wanting to come to our conference, just because people were what the heck is HPV? Why do we need to know about this? I'd rather care about other topics. But during those times, we still had each other. I had my ambassadors, I had my executive council. Just to anyone who's really, really nervous to start advocating about a topic that seemingly they think no one else cares about, that is not true. Trust me, you will find people who care. And then once you find them, everything becomes way easier and you feel a weight is lifted off of your chest for sure.